Yeah, I truly look at teaching as both an art and a science. I think it is a balance between that. And I think it's the artistry, that we sometimes need to get back to for our teachers.
Welcome to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I'm your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations with educational leaders and experts. My hope is to share with you not only valuable insights and knowledge from leaders in education, but have fun while doing it and shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. Every school has its own unique challenges and culture. And when a new initiative such as MTSS comes along, it might seem easier just to replace the old ways with the new. However, our guest today, Christine Downing, says that an important aspect of MTSS implementation is to start with examining the aspects of MTSS that are already happening at the building level, and then build on those practices. Christine Downing is an educator and leader of 30 years in New Hampshire, often taking on dual roles for small districts such as a building principal and the district curriculum director. She currently serves as the director of curriculum and instruction for 3 different districts, helping educators get the resources they need to support students. In our conversation today, we talk about leveraging resources and the importance of building a teacher toolbox. We also dive into some foundational aspects of a strong MTSS practice. Enjoy, and as always, thanks for listening. Well, today on the podcast, we are excited to welcome Christine Downey, who is the Director of Curriculum and Instruction Assessments for three districts in New Hampshire. You sound like a very busy woman. And starting out, like, if in a position like that, how do you manage your time?
Well, thanks for inviting me on the podcast, Larissa. I appreciate it. Yeah, this is actually a new role. It's brand new for these 3 districts. They're relatively 3 small districts. It's in rural New Hampshire. And each district has its own unique quirk, but they need the resources of curriculum instruction and assessment administration to really help. And a lot of those duties were falling on the principals. And as we know, principals have a lot to do in their schools, right? So right now it's we're trying things out, and I do a couple days a week in some districts and then rotate. We're really focused on how we can get shared resources across the 3 districts. And one of the things that all 3 districts have already identified is, they always can grow and improve in their MTSS structures. One district does use branching minds, which is great. The other district is really interested in it. So I think my role is to really see how I can leverage resources for these 3 small districts that might not be on their radar or might not be accessible to them as individual districts. It does keep me busy, but that's the nature of who I am. I'm not a person that can sit long or stay in any place long. I like to be out interactive with teachers and students and leaders. So I'm trying it, and right now I got to say we're about 2 months into the role and absolutely loving it.
Well, I'm sure it probably has its challenges and, every place maybe needs something different. But I like what you said about leveraging resources because that's the thing that I see and a lot of times when we talk about MTSS, we talk about just managing your resources and like part of, gathering your data is really to understand of like which school needs this kind of resource and which school needs this kind of resource and everybody maybe needs something different. And so do you find in your work that like people are excited to have someone who's sort of strategically thinking about that alongside them.
Absolutely. I think honestly that's a missing link a lot of times is we have a lot of resources out there, right? But do we have a way to actually track their use, their effectiveness, right? One of the things I like to do with all districts that I'm in is develop what I call kind of your assessment intervention and assessment inventory and schedule, right? What are you using? Why are you using? What purpose is it using? And one more thing that I think is really super important is, who are your local so-called experts in these different areas, right? Who's received the training, who uses it regularly, right? And so we can build on the capacity from within. And so I do think there is a need of this idea of leveraging resources. Education today, as we all know it, it's a high pressure profession, right? Lots coming at people at once. And I think the better we can get at leveraging resources efficiently, I think we kind of maybe reduce some of that stress and overwhelmingness that seems to be permeating our education workforce these days.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the work of the leader, it's not necessarily always the work of a principal or even a district leader is to really think about how can we leverage resources and make the job of the classroom teacher less of that pressure of finding the right resources. Like, how do we help them do their job? Because I feel like as a classroom teacher, when I'm concerned about trying to find the best kind of resources for my students or the best materials, and I'm having to do all that work, that's energy that's taken away from other things, right? And so I think that is about like that the leader's role really is to help alleviate that stress that teachers maybe feel to find the best resources for their students. And so I think you're right. Like in education, so that's a big hot topic. I think resources in general, and resources don't, for me, I don't think that just means materials. It also means personnel and like you said, the experts. Who are the people that understand the idea of MTSS or even just any kind of experts in the building. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I would agree completely with you, Larissa. One of the things that I take from a leadership perspective that I've always brought to all my curriculum instruction and assessment roles is that I also believe that there's not one perfect panacea for everything, right? And I agree with you. I think resources are personnel, commercial programs, et cetera. I'm also a firm believer that one particular program, we always go through those commercial program adoption cycles, right? Oh, we're buying this program, that program. And what happens is we find out a couple years later or into the implementation, well, it's not quite doing this, or it doesn't really meet this need, or it's doing way too much of this, right? So I like to create with teachers and with leaders what I call the teacher toolbox. I want to give you the different tools, and tools are not, I mean, it can be any type of resource, like you said, personnel resource, programming resource, etc. But I want to give you a toolbox that I always say is your like 95% go-to, right? Like when you need to find those tools to engage students, right? To prep activities, etc. You've got a pretty sufficient toolbox to grab from, and maybe there is that 5% where you go find those extra tools and resources that perhaps meet your artistry of teaching, right? But I always like to create what I call that teacher toolbox.
Mm, yeah. Well, because I've worked in smaller districts and bigger districts, and I always feel like the hard part about a really large district is when you purchase a curriculum, right? Like the spans of a district, maybe, your demographics in every school is maybe very different. And so that curriculum may not always fit, or the resources may not always be right. So if you can create a toolbox of those kind of resources, it's really helpful because then that teacher maybe feels the freedom to say, hey, I have this kind of demographic of student in my classroom. For example, like a short story that maybe resonates with my students. And so like, I think that having that freedom is really important. I love that you called it like a toolbox, because I think that every teacher, like as you go through the profession, you sort of put more things in your toolbox, whether it be classroom management strategies or lessons that you love, or, the go-to people to, to ask your questions. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I truly look at teaching as both an art and a science. I think it is a balance between that. And I think it's the artistry, that we sometimes need to get back to for our teachers. We've got a lot of science behind teachers, right? We look at a lot of data, we have standards that we map to, et cetera. But I think the pandemic added to that artistry, like it opened up the world of digital learning, right? That I know personally in my own school when I was a former principal. Um, my teachers would always have goals of, I want to get better at digital learning and applications, right? Well, the pandemic kind of forced us to do that. So, that toolbox has grown most definitely. So I really think that that's the artistry of teaching. And that's the job of a curriculum instruction and assessment leader. That's how I always view it is to build that toolbox for them.
Oh man, I really appreciate what you said, because I think the art and science, you're right. And we talk a lot about on this podcast, and even just at Branching Minds, about the science of teaching, and science of learning in general. And I do think that should be that always, because there's the bit of magic that happens, I think, with educators, is that bit of you in the classroom understanding your students, and that relationship part of teaching is a little bit of an art and all of that. So I appreciate that you said that. So with your sort of experience with MTSS, you've been at this a while. Like, what are there kind of any nuggets or anything that you sort of latched onto with MTSS that you feel like this was the thing that I like? Yes, I believe in MTSS as a great process for districts. Like, what was the thing that maybe made, like, sunk in for you?
So yeah, I firmly am passionate about MTSS. It's one of my wheelhouses that I really support schools and educators and leaders in developing for students. Before I get into what part of the MTSS process I think is kind of most valuable, like you said, to latch onto, I just want to put a plug out there that I think MTSS is how we really differentiate learning and actually provide these things like differentiation for students, individualization of learning, personalization of learning, right? People use those synonymously, but they have different connotations and meanings behind them, right? So I think it's your MTSS structure that can really allow you to explore those pathways for students and meet those needs, right? So I think for me, a couple key things for the MTSS process that I latch onto is number one, the team I put around that structure. I think the key players you put on your MTSS team are important. And they each have, again, going back to an expertise, so that when you are, looking at the needs of a student, I used to call this in my former school, that I used to call this what we called our MTSS draft. We ran it like the NFL draft. And here's what I mean by that. We be studying a student, right? And their particular needs, and it'd be like, okay, which coach is going to draft this student onto their team, right? Onto their group, whether it was an intervention group or, particular intervention strategies, who was going to be the coach for that student. So I think the team, how you form that team is important in the MTSS system. Who you have on it, I think you need a variety of players with a variety of backgrounds. And I also think your team can be fluid, meaning, sure, you can have core team members, but you have other team members that may join based on individual student needs. So you got to have real fluidity in that team composition, I think. That's one of the areas I latch onto, because I think with a good team, your MTSS structure, all your protocols fall right into place. So I think team's
Mm.
important. And I think the next thing I would say is that how you conduct your MTSS sessions, whether they're meetings, whatever you call them, but whatever those sessions are with that team, that they have a structure to them, right? And it's clear. In curriculum, we talk about four essential questions. What do we want kids to know and be able to do? How are we going to measure it? What do we do if they get it? What do we do if they don't get it? Right? those questions pull right into an MTSS structure when you're discussing a student. And so I think if you can structure your time, because time is probably the most valuable commodity we don't have, right, in education. Um, if you can structure that time, very protocol driven, this is our purpose as a team. This is how we process through the information. This is how we develop our plans. This is how we put in the accountability checks and balances of who's doing what to support the child, right? And then how we measure it and we come back, that whole cycle, right? I think if you can put structure to how you use that time, it's going to give you a leverage. So I always talk to folks with MTSS about, one, pay attention to your team out of the gate, pay attention to how you structure. And then I think natural evolutions that come out of those two big linchpins in the process, I would say, is now the conversation around, well, do we have the right interventions set up? Do we have the right people in place? And of course, that often requires some strategic funding planning,
Mhm.
on schools about how to meet the needs in that particular area. But teams are super important, and how you structure that time with team, I think, gets you off. Because I think without those two things, you don't have a foundation that strong to
Mhm.
sustain that MTSS system.
Yeah, because then it sometimes turns into like one person's job and
Mhm.
one person carries the weight of that. And really, the magic of MTSS is really about the collaboration and the decision making that happens within the room when you bring all the different experts to the table. And I say experts, and the expert of the teacher that really knows the student and the parent, and even your school psychologist and your other and school counselors and all the other people who have insights that can be helpful in those ways. And so I like that you said that. We talk, like I said before, is like we talk about resources, and really one of your most powerful resources in a school is the knowledge and expertise of your educators. And we can't, I just feel like to deny that, or even to not highlight that and make that the most important, is really to do a disservice to all that educators, know, especially I think really experienced and veteran educators who have the years of experience and maybe even just the training that they've been through. So I know the longer you're in education, that more training and things that you put in your toolbox. And so in your work, I know you're working in these three different districts. Is there like a challenge that you've faced in implementing MTSS in these three different kinds of districts, or even just in your past work as a principal? I'm curious about just like a challenge that you faced and how you sort of work through that.
So, Larissa, let me just back up a little bit with my history. While I'm working with three districts currently right now, I just joined these three districts this current school year. And for the last 5 years, I was actually in a district where I again had dual roles. I think it's my nature as a educator to have dual roles. So I was actually an elementary principal for a K-5 elementary school in our former district, but I was also the curriculum director for the entire district. So I not only oversaw the school that I was principal of, but I also helped guide curriculum instruction and assessment in 6 other schools across the district. So I think your question is really interesting. That how does this dynamic play out, right? Because you have an MTSS system when you look district wide, right? So you have certain district consistencies you want to an MTSS structure and system, right? But what you've got to honor is the unique approaches each of those schools are going to take, because every school has its own different climate and culture. So I think that would be, to your question about what have I found in working, even, in the short time I've been with these three districts, is that, it goes right to that each school may call their particular MTSS team something different, an SST team, a child assistant team, right? But that has meaning to them, and you need to value that, right? And so I think the key, I find, the unifying theme when you're working across multiple schools or multiple districts, is that everybody has the basic understanding of what MTS is designed to do and the whole cycle of that process. And I call it a cycle because it's a constant check in, right, on student progress and how they're doing and coming back and making sure that progress is always moving forward. And I think once you get those structures in place, I think the logistical part, which is where you see differences play out amongst the schools, may look different, from how they run their data meetings with teachers to how they might involve parents. And so you got to recognize the culture and climate of each of the schools you're working in. But if you teach everybody the consistent structures, I think you get a system district wide that does exactly what you want it to do.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right in honoring sort of the uniqueness of each school, because there is a little bit of like everybody, has in every school, there's like a language you have to learn of just like what things are called here. And so, but there is a particular of honoring each of those schools in a way that gives that dignity, because I think there is a little bit of when if you're a new person and you come in and you try to change things right away, like it's like, hey, we're actually doing good work. There's things we can build upon. We don't have to change all the names of stuff, but making sure that basic structure is in place. And you're right, like as long as that basic structure and understanding is in place, like call the meeting whatever you want to call it. Like as long as it's doing its work, doing its job.
Yeah, and folks have different players on their team, right? I think it goes back to your comment about honoring the expertise of the teachers, right? And that's what you have to really be mindful of as you work across different schools, is that expertise level of the different teachers and the different observations, the different relationships they're going to bring with the students, right? And that's got value. And that value added of honoring that is something you pay attention to within each school.
Mm,
And specialists will play different roles in schools. And you'll always find, I have found, working over multiple schools like this, that you always find, I like to say this and I'll say it because I am, you always find that data geek amongst the MTS, that just thrives on that data, and that will vary from person to person, but that's a key player in the process. But you always find them in the schools, and it might just look a little different.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I kind of want to go back to that idea of honoring the expertise of teachers. I think in general, when we talk about how stressful and how hard education is in general, there is a bit of honoring the expertise of not only teachers, but anyone in the building. I think that gives dignity to the profession even more, is when we sort of recognize what everybody brings to the table. And, I talk a lot with different people on and off this podcast just about how, there's a lot of teachers that are struggling to want to stay in a profession that feels like they've been dishonored or, disempowered. And I think that for me, when I look at how MTSS running in a great way can really give that dignity and honor to the work of everyone that comes to the table, that we all have a part to play within helping intervene and support students. And how, and I always thought as a middle school teacher, I was just a drop in the bucket of this child's educational experience. And so sort of understanding that we all have a drop in the bucket of helping that student feel successful, and change the trajectory of their lives. So I just wanted to sort of like expand on that thought a little bit. And so, yeah.
I totally think MTSS, that entire process, honors that and the hard work that teachers do on an individual basis. We're not a factory model anymore, right? It's not, we're educating the masses. We are literally educating every child one at a time to the best of our abilities, right? And I think there's nothing like honoring teachers when I'll just share an example. So when I was principal in my elementary school, one of the key things to an MTSS system is teaching students how to read their own data, right? So when you're progress monitoring, you can give them the results right back, and they can look at their own growth charts, right? And we would do that a lot with the students in the elementary school. Um, and the teachers would send the students down to me when they got their reports, because the students would be so excited to show the teachers, look, this is my growth, I'm doing great things. And the teachers would then send them down to me as a principal, because it was just super cool if I could go see Mrs. Downing and get some special thing because my growth chart was looking so awesome, right? But then I would turn right around and I'd have something in my desk for the teacher, and I'd say, who's a major helper, who really helped you to make this group growth. And the student would name the teacher, and I say, let's give that teacher this gift. And so the child would go back to the teacher and say, I want to thank you for my growth here. Here's, like, we had
Oh my
cards,
God.
we had little things. And that's the culture thing you need to pay attention to, in honoring and valuing that. Hey, I know you're working really hard. You have a class of 20 kids, and you know every 20 of those plans inside and out. You on a drop of a hat can figure out what they need. We need to honor that and value that. And there's nothing like seeing a teacher get one of those little treats from a student, and just, the whole cementing of the relationship that develops there. And that's a key component of MTSS that I don't think you can train people in, that you just have to realize that the relationship between the educator and the children receiving those interventions is just as important as a relationship between a classroom teacher and their whole class, right? And
Yeah.
it's all a microcosm of the bigger educational system we have, right?
Oh, I agree. And I don't know if you could tell I'm a little teary, and I'm thinking about the idea that teacher acknowledging the hard work that goes into helping a student grow. And just like that's an investment on their part. And I think acknowledging that, and that's building that, you're right, like building that culture that we all sort of had a part to play. And I think as teachers, there's a lot of times that it's a thankless job. And so there's just a bit of, that some of those small recognitions. Like, I mean, it's like I always still have a box of all the notes that different students wrote to me, like we all have that box in that folder, and just knowing that, like, okay, we did make a difference in that student's life, this week, and saw their growth. And I love that. That's fantastic. I was going to ask you for an example of sort of how you've seen MTSS at work. Do you have any other that, like, for a particular student that you feel like exemplifies the power that MTSS can have?
Oh, I sure do. I had a particular child. He was in first grade, demonstrating some real difficulties in literacy, particularly just in, like, oral reading, and, getting that fluency going, right. And we followed the MTSS structure pretty succinctly, and continually tried to meet 6 to 8 weeks on the child, tried interventions, would try it a little bit longer. And what we constantly found was the child was making growth, but then would plateau, right? So we'd be like, okay, what's not working? And we keep going. And finally we hit about midway through second grade. We took a good year and a half to really figure out what could we do for this child through our MTSS system. And about midway through second grade, we finally said, we're missing something. We're missing something from a more, processing capability in terms of, what's just going on in the brain, in terms of how he processes when it comes to reading, and everything that's involved with that, from decoding, encoding, font, you name it, right? And we finally felt confident enough to say to the parents, we've tried X, Y, and Z, and the parents were a partner in all of this work, that we finally had to make a referral to special education. I guess the resounding part that MTSS was important in our school system, and I think it turned on the light bulb for a lot of people that it's important, is that when we went to make that referral to special ed, and the special ed team then came to the table, the full team, they were like, wow, look at the data you guys already have on this student. You're already providing, to the point that we were able to, not have to do certain levels of evaluation on this student, and that we could pinpoint more clearly and actually then get the individualized services we need for this child. And I think that's an important thing to remember about MTSS. I'm a big proponent of this. So often MTSS is seen as also this extension of special ed. And I actually say it's the other way around. MTSS is a component of general education. And if we do it right, then when we go to recommend students for specialized services, we're a leg up. We're much farther ahead in the process than if we're just starting from ground zero to recommend those specialized services. And
Yeah.
as we know, what we've already spoken to saves time on our personnel, right? In terms of conducting evaluations, getting to know the child. It saves resources, right? And here's the thing, it can provide a smooth transition to a child that may be coming more into an individualized program, right?
Mm.
Under special ed rules and regulations. And so I think that I always like to share that example of my first grader who, we worked really hard and we never gave up. And because of that, we were actually able to pinpoint the success of that story is so student received specialized services for about second half of the second grade year, all of third grade year, and was pretty much back on track come fourth grade.
That's awesome.
And when he exited out of my building in fifth grade, um, to go off to middle school, we actually put him on a monitoring plan. So it's a success story of all systems coming together and interventions coming together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's really important to remember is that, the MTSS is for everyone, right? It's not just that special ed kind of thing, component of that. And how like it can help serve the students who need that more specialized service, but not like as an extension of that. And so, and that's, I think, a hard concept for some people to really understand that like MTSS isn't in the same, they're in the same realm, but like under the same umbrella of a school, but not in the same boat necessarily, maybe. I'm mixing analogies.
Nope, I totally get it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not like I always get this way with my guests. I want to just chat about all of these different things. But I am curious about, in your work, like what would you say to those that maybe are getting started with the MTSS process in the school? I know that there's a lot of schools out there looking for ways to help intervene for students, after some disrupted learning. And so really looking at ways of like, how can we really target interventions? How can we really help students grow? So what would you say to those people who are just getting started?
So the first thing I think I would say to them is study the MTSS process first and really take a hard look at what components of the MTSS process you might already be doing in place and then to enhance those. And I always say build out a 3 to 5 year plan, like to build your MTSS structure with clear components on what do you want to focus on first. For example, do you just need to start with a good screening, a universal screening measure, right? And what is that going to look like? And how are you going to use that screening measure, right? To maybe inform tier one instruction right in the classroom and wrap around core instruction that's happening right in the classroom, right? So take the time to study what MTSS process is all about. It does have distinct components to it, like steps along the way to do it and figure out what are we kind of already doing that we can enhance on, because I always like to call that the low hanging fruit. Like you're already doing something, just make it better, right? And really solidify it. And then map out all the other components. And when I find people take that strategic planning approach, they've got an MTSS system that's sustainable. And so I would just first, my guess is people are already forming informal teams together, student teams, they might call them student chat teams, whatever, right? They're already putting these teams together to look at students. Great. Okay, maybe look at how are those teams forming? How consistent are they? How regularly are they meeting? Do you have protocols when you're getting it? Start there first because you're already doing that, right? That usually the next thing I recommend is now take a look at what are the measures you're using to measure that growth, right? Do you have some already in place? Are you using them to their fullest capability? Do you have your data geeks in the building that really know them and understand them, right? And so I think you got to do this cross reference between, it's almost like a self analysis. Here's what MTS is all about. What do we got going on currently? And what are easy adjustments we can make to the current? And then what are those more long reaching, aspects that we're going to have to build into our process that makes us an entire MTSS system. Because,
Mm.
that typically gets into personnel planning, funding, right? Um, but I think you got to be strategic. That's the biggest thing I would tell people is don't just say, okay, we're doing MTSS now and kind of leave, have a good shared understanding of what the MTS model, the future model, it's, backwards planning design, just like we do in curriculum. Kind of know what you want your future to be in 3 to 5 years and then backwards plan it down.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that you're right. Like the idea that really thinking about it from a 3 to 5 year plan of it's not going to just happen overnight. And it's, in order for it to not be another thing, I liked your approach of just like, look at what you're already doing, enhance that and build from there. And so, and be patient. I think being patient with the growth that can happen, in a school, because I feel like a school district is an ecosystem of its own of just, there's unique things that happen, and you can't just guarantee that everything will run smoothly. Actually
Oh,
guarantee
no.
that it won't. So well, thank you so much for sharing about your MTSS work and just your expertise and all of that. One of the last questions, because this is kind of a fun podcast, and I'm always switching up my fun question here at the end, but so we call this this podcast Schooling Around, and we love to have fun here at Branching Minds. And one of the things that I think about Schooling Around, it kind of sounds like an after school special. And so the question that I ask these days is, as a kid, when you think about like an after school snack, like what was your maybe favorite after school snack?
So this is a funny one. My favorite after school snack. So when I was a child or right now with
I
my
mean,
kids?
even now you can always like, if you don't have one from as a kid, you can always do one now too.
Well, I got to tell you, in elementary schools, everybody is so great about filling the teacher's room with sweets. So I'm going to just have to stay the standard. Anything chocolate is a favorite after school snack for anybody that works in an elementary school these days. I think the chocolate fix is helps with some of the stress that people deal with. But I can tell you, as a student, when I was going through elementary school, I could, because I remember this vividly, walking down to one of our local little candy stores. I got to tell you, do you remember the fireballs, the red hot fireballs?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
They had the cinnamon. That was my favorite snack as a young elementary student. I love that
That's amazing.
that
That like
cinnamon kind of.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's like a cinnamony like flavor. Oh, I didn't like that because I didn't like cinnamon as a kid. I don't know why. I love it now, but as a kid, for some reason, I thought it was too spicy. I love that, and you're right. Like we will gladly fill the teacher's lounge with a little bit of chocolate, and I was had a little bit of stash in my desk because sometimes some days it would just be needed a little bit more. But thank you so much for sharing. I love that that's your vivid memory as a kid. Well, I just thank you so much for being here, and I just loved chatting with you, and yeah, thank you for all your work.
Thank you, Larissa.
Thanks for listening to Schoolin' Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast to hear all our future episodes. As well, if you're enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcast on iTunes? This helps others find our podcast and let us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn @Branching Minds.